Season 1 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Carl Haley, Daniel Murphy, and Douglas Dollars, who reminds you to be present, be loving, and that life moves really fast. Talking to comedy writers, I've learned one thing in particular, that a comedic performer is a tool, and not like a tool in the modern sense like idiot. I mean tool in the sense of like literally an instrument. Comedy writers will tell me about how their craft changes, what they learn about the way they do their craft by using these various tools that are performers. What does using a tool like Conan O'Brien tell you about the way you write comedy?
I mean, are you talking about working through Conan O'Brien?
I'm talking about, you can generalize it out to any of these instruments you use, these performers, but, you know, when you're using the voice or persona, an established voice or persona, when you're writing through one, what has it told you about what you're good at comedically? It's a very broad question, I realize, but not even what's the most important thing. What's just something that comes to mind that it's taught you about the way you write?
Well, I do think that one of the things I've kind of learned writing for Conan in particular, because he does have such a specific voice, is it's kind of what I've learned about my own personality, is that I find that if I spend enough time around somebody, I start to become that person a little bit. Like I am a little bit of a cipher in that way. And I think with Conan, it really was just the more time I spend around him, the more the process of writing for him is kind of seamless, you know, and you start to go, well, this would feel weird for him to say, or this would require him to act in a way that's very unnatural for him. And it's just like being around a person for a long time. You start to kind of adjust to their rhythms. And in my case, I do think you start to sort of let your voice hopefully become their voice a little bit, or at least surrender your voice to theirs. I think that's more likely what I do, which is also a huge, I think talking to other writers on that show and other shows where you're basically writing for a personality. One of the existential crises you kind of face is you get hired because you think, you know, ostensibly you're hired because there's something about you in particular they like. You know, they've seen your stand up, or they've watched you perform. They've seen short films you've done. They've read your writing, and they see a kind of interesting and particular voice that they think is at least compatible. And then through the process of writing for a show like Conan or some other, you know, like Letterman or some other personality, very big personality, you do start to kind of surrender a little bit of what maybe was unique about you. And I think everybody sort of reaches that point where they start to panic a little bit and look for ways to sort of kind of recapture their own voice. You know, whether it's getting back into stand-up or finding your own writing projects on the side, things like that.
It's Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall. And audience, let me introduce you to Todd Levin, comedian, writer, and comedy writer. He's written for Conan O'Brien's multitude of late-night evening shows. He's contributed to the Onion News Network. You'll also have seen his contributions, in Sex, Our Bodies, Our Junk, the book that previous guest Scott Jacobson also contributed to. You'll maybe have read his articles in Gourmet and Vanity Fair and the Morning News, in GQ, and GQ especially had an article by him that got much tweeted around about the whole disintegration of one particular Conan show, which ultimately led to the formation of a new one. But that's been much discussed in the news for too long, perhaps. But let me ask you this about the sort of pleasures of being a cipher. As an interviewer, I get often called that myself, and there's a certain fun to that, isn't there? You sort of saying, okay, if I'm going to be a cipher, let me use that and see what I can get away with.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is something really fun about it because, well, part of it is it's like it's like a little writing challenge, how can I pull off this person's voice? Like I recently had to write something for Julia Louis-Dreyfus, an unrelated project, and I knew that she was going to be reading it, and it was purely her reading this thing, and there's something kind of exciting about studying the person you're writing for and trying to sort of picture them saying these things and finding what you think are kind of the right, I guess matching up with their own tics, their own sort of like comedic tics or things that, I guess people find endearing about them. Yeah, it's going to sound stupid, but it's sort of like, it's like painting a portrait, it's a very cheap, it's like actually it's more like doing a caricature, I guess, nothing as noble as painting a portrait.
Well, what the caricature gets at that the portrait doesn't is you're asking yourself, would this person say this, but not in the sense of, has this person said this? Mm-hmm. It's like speculative. It's like painting a portrait of them doing something you've never seen them do while they're not sitting there. A portrait, usually they're sitting there, you're going from that reference. But you're writing for them. You're writing original material, which is like painting a portrait with no reference of them to go by, right? You've never seen them drive a go-kart, but the caricaturist may draw that.
Right. I think it's a lot like, even though we're dealing with real personalities like Conan O'Brien, I think it's probably a lot like television writers who join the staff of an established television show and they're writing for these fictional characters. Now, the goal is to write something they've never said before or never done before, but still have that feel very familiar to that character. And I don't think it's any different with, someone like Conan. And, you're not always writing for him directly, but he is the kind of brand of the show. So maybe you're creating a sketch or some character that Conan, barely even interacts with or doesn't, drive. But it still has to sort of feel like that belongs on that stage.
You're almost writing for the voice that is the show rather than the voice that is him, aren't you?
Yeah, yeah. And one thing I had to kind of be careful of is I grew up as a huge fan of Late Night with Conan O'Brien. I really loved the show. And a habit that I kind of had to break a little bit was writing for the legacy of that show rather than writing for what Conan imagines the show is now, And I think a lot of us have had that problem. I think particularly a lot of the veteran writers on the staff who have been at Late Night for so many years, it's so familiar. That's so familiar to them. So that I think that adjustment is a little bit more difficult sometimes. Trying to figure out, okay, what's the voice now, like going forward, and make those little adjustments.
And for the listeners who might not know the full chronology, I mean, there was Late Night with Conan O'Brien, there was The Tonight Show with Conan O'Brien briefly, there then was and now is Conan on TBS. And, it makes me think of, I've heard this about writing on The Simpsons, and of course that was a show Conan O'Brien himself wrote for 20 years ago or so, but on The Simpsons, I as I understand it, I don't know anybody who writes for that show, but it is now, if not mostly then, as a big chunk of writers who grew up watching The Simpsons all the time, learning comedy from The Simpsons, and then it's sort of a feedback loop. It's like the Ouroboros, the worm that eats its own tail. Now, how early did Late Night with Conan O'Brien come in your sort of comedic development, for your own sensibility? Was it super formative, or was it just kind of one neat thing among many that was shaping you at that time?
I think I think the things that were a little bit more formative were things that happened when I was a little younger. Late Night started when I was in college, and by then I had already sort of been feeding off of certain things comedically, like Monty Python and Kids in the Hall for sketch, and Letterman. Letterman was hugely informative because it was like just watching this professional smartass all the time, and I think that influence is really, really hard to shake. Like I really do think that he was this kind of great sort of champion of the sort of weakling smartass, like, and that was very, very formative for me. Right. But I think Late Night, what inspired me about it was the lunacy of it. And I think it just, I would watch that show and it just clicked with a lot of things that I had already found funny. But strange things like Looney Tunes cartoons and some very old fashioned kinds of things comedically. And I always loved that they really kind of respected that. And I think The Simpsons was like that too. There's a sort of respect for a tradition of comedy and of a tradition of like performance and all the kind of cliches of performance all the way back from, vaudeville or earlier. And they play with all those and play with all those archetypes, like Keystone Cops and things like that would appear on the show, or all, just ridiculous things like prospectors. And,
whether we're talking about Letterman or Conan O'Brien, we're talking about guys who somehow have appealed to both hardcore comedy nerds and, in some sense, the mainstream, or a big enough chunk of the mainstream to please a large network. I guess, do you see them as that? And I wonder what that is. Is that in comedy a kind of golden calf to attain, that you have the nerds, but you have regular people as well? Or is that even something that's thought about in the world of comedy writing?
Not for me personally, and that may be a weakness, but I'm sure that's more of a consideration for Conan, since his name's on the show, and for the executive producer, because they worry about the show being successful in that way, I would imagine. I rarely consider that. And I think that since we tape live, when we have a studio audience, I do find that I'm often the guy who says, why do we have to worry about whether this is funny to the 200 people who are here for this taping? And what if it's funny to the other million people who are watching this at home? Because I always considered myself one of them. When I was watching late night, there would be certain sketches, especially the infamous like Act 3 sketches, that were just so weird, and they would commit to them and they would fill up the whole act with them, and they would sometimes get no laughs at all. And you would just sense the audience just being bewildered by them. But those were always the things that I remembered the most. And those were always the things that struck me the most, because it was something you'd never seen before.
What would be an example of a severely audience bewildering late bit on the show?
Okay. I'm trying to think of one that... Okay, well, there's one thing... I'll give you two examples. One was they had a guy interrupting Conan. This is often something they did at late night. We do it less so now. But at late night, they would often have an idiot in the audience interrupt Conan. And that was a sort of regular gimmick. And the one time they had a guy who wrote all the copy on the side of the boxes of Tetley tea. I think it was Tetley tea. It might have been a different tea. Oh, no, it was Bigelow tea. It was Bigelow tea.
Now, that I can imagine. I'm not a comedy writer, but I now know enough about comedy writers to know that Tetley versus Bigelow was a conversation. Yeah, that was like 3 hours, right?
Yes. Because there's a different style that would go with Bigelow versus Tetley. So
somebody got sent out to buy boxes, right?
Oh, or somebody just understood it implicitly. I think it's more of that. It's that somebody had it at home. That's almost always how comedy ends up on those shows. Like that kind of comedy ends up on those shows where somebody has something in the room or something at home, and they're like, "Oh, I was just thinking how funny the copy is on these." And there was a guy from this tea company, and then another guy in the audience from another tea company who wrote their copy, and they start kind of having words, and they decide the only way to settle it is through a cage match. And they just come up on stage and they fight in a cage, and one of them is killed. And that was it. That was the whole thing. There was no pretext for it at all. And you could sense that the audience was just kind of going, what just happened,
But that's as legitimate and as readable a reaction as laughter. I mean, if they were looking at their phones, that's a different story. But you got something there. Probably what was desired, I would imagine.
Yeah, and I think that you should never be afraid of that. There are different degrees of silence, and you have to become a connoisseur of silence. When you're doing comedy, that's a little bit out of bounds. You have to understand whether it's a bored silence or indifferent silence or just a kind of shocked and confused silence.
Right. It's not like you're getting laughter or not. It's not the Catskills. You're not judging just the volume of the laughs you get back, and you're getting them or you're not. There's this whole 3D spectrum of reactions you can get, and you don't always want to be on the same point. And
reverberations, that sort of like maybe that piece of comedy dies on the vine, in front of that live audience, but it could have this sort of ripple effect in the, in culture, like, even if it's a very sort of deep underground ripple. And those are always the things I liked. And the other one I was thinking of was a guy who, John Glazer would do these great characters that just had one very specific annoying thing they did, but he would just commit to it so hard. And I always really enjoyed watching him. And he did a thing where it's not going to translate for audio, but he just wanted to be on the show because he did this kind of dance where it was just a dance with his thumbs. And Conan was just going, that's not impressive. No, you don't deserve to be on a show just because you can do this dance. And then suddenly it escalated where everybody else was on board and thought the dance was amazing. and it got to the point, it escalated so much that somebody came out from the wings with a scale model for something called Yeah Yeah Estates, because the guy, I think it was called Yeah Yeah Estates, because the guy did a kind of yeah yeah with the dance. And he was building an entire planned community in honor of this guy's dance. Excellent.
I mean, that sort of thing can't not get a reaction. People are going to react to it, and it's, you get to feed off of that to an extent. And I wonder, when you've written many articles and you've written also straight to the web, and you've used text, is my point. What reaction do you feed off of when you do that?
It's very lonely. I think that's part of the reason.
That's why writers are so unhappy so often.
Deeply. You spend a lot of time with yourself. It's not a great place, not a great person to spend time with. I think it's one of the reasons I was drawn to performing was because it is so lonely, especially when you're trying to write humor. I don't know. I think, when I write pieces like that, my feeling is just, does this feel complete? Have I said something that feels thorough and complete? And I'll think, well, this part's funny or that part's funny, and maybe people will find it funny or not, or remember this part or that part. But I really try to think more in terms of like, am I sending out a complete thought that, is easily processed as that, rather than just these sort of fragments of ideas. But yeah, there really isn't. Now that everything's online, there's almost too much feedback. When we wrote the Joy of Sex parody book, Our Bodies Are Junk, a lot of online publications released excerpts from the book to varying degrees of success, But they'd always have comment threads like Salon or Huffington Post, and just the range of emotions, responding to this silly, what we thought was just a silly parody book, people would just become angry and dismissive, and then dismissive of, I remember somebody on Huffington Post saying, not only is it funny, it makes me think that all the programs these people write for aren't funny, because one of the writers wrote for The Daily Show and someone else wrote for The Onion, and I was writing for Conan at the time, and I guess that was listed in our credits for the book. So people were deciding like none of it's funny now.
Just because they didn't like the book, or they didn't like that it existed, or what was the actual objection?
I don't know. Maybe seeing a passage like that out of context. I think sometimes with a book like where you're doing a kind of comprehensive parody of something, to see a small passage of it out of context maybe is a little bit weird, and to somebody who, I don't know, is easily moved to emotion, is easily enraged, they might see that as just, they're just writing a bunch of dumb sex jokes.
Oh, sure.
I don't want to read a bunch of dumb sex jokes, but I feel like a book like that is better experienced whole.
You have to have the heft. You have to have the memory of seeing the joy of sex around on parents' friends' coffee tables. You know, online excerpts. I mean, you're parodying something that predates online excerpts of anything. That predates the online world. Yeah. But I wonder, with the sort of stuff people label online feedback, whether it's comments or anonymous blog posts or non-anonymous blog posts, I get the impression from comedy writers and comedy performers that stuff isn't very useful. I mean, it seems like it would be, you could farm out, or you could sort of plow the ground and pull out a few useful carrot-like nuggets of feedback. But it seems people always say, "No, I don't look at it anymore." Like they did.
I think you have to stop, because I do think it becomes just an incredible distraction, whether it's positive feedback or negative feedback, because
none of it helps.
I mean, I hate to say that. I mean, maybe I shouldn't say none of it helps. Some of it might help,
right?
But is it worth picking out, or is it worth digging through all of the crazy, either angry or, kind of unqualified positive feedback that you get just to find that one nugget of kind of constructive criticism? Right. Or I don't know. I mean,
that's more likely to come from somebody who knows you, maybe.
Yeah, or somebody who, who doesn't post comments on Huffington Post. I hate to say it, but
I don't know anybody who does that.
Yeah,
and yet they exist.
Yeah, and I don't know if you've ever posted a negative comment on a site like, a general interest site like New York Times or Huffington Post or something like.
No, I haven't done it. No, I'm trying to. I'm going back in the memory banks, and I think it's people. I figure it's people a lot older or a little younger than I am. I think I'm in the wrong demo.
Yeah, that could very well be it. I know that there have been times that I've been moved to do that, but then haven't, because I've thought, like, anytime I've committed something unsolicited and negative to the page, I've never felt better about myself.
Right.
You
don't go through the day with a spring in your step.
Yeah, I've never felt like, well, I'm glad I took care of that.
It reminds me.
I've just improved this person's life.
I just told them what's what.
Yeah.
I was watching recently the documentary Conan O'Brien Can't Stop about his performance tour between the end of The Tonight Show with Conan O'Brien and Conan on TBS. And I think he has a moment in that where someone asks him, do you read the feedback on the internet about that specific tour? And he's like, no, I don't do that. And you never quite believe a celebrity when they say that, but I believed him.
I think that's really true about him. And I've heard that from other people. In fact, when I wrote this piece for GQ about the dissolution of the Tonight Show, Conan's wife had to convince him to read it.
He wasn't going to read that.
He wasn't going to read it. Yeah. I did the courtey of submitting a draft to him before I, sent the final edit to the editor, because I didn't want to, it was a weird time, and I didn't want to step on anybody's toes. I didn't want to make anybody uncomfortable, but I didn't want to be dishonest in the piece. And they were fine with, there were no changes, but our executive producer read it, but Conan had not read it. And it wasn't until much later, we were just talking one day at work, and he said that his wife finally made him read it. Because he said he doesn't like to read anything, like any profiles on himself or anything about himself, because it just makes him self-conscious. And I think that there's,
Yet immediate audience feedback is good for some of these performers. They love that, but not the detached stuff, not the stuff later.
It's not the detached stuff. It's not the sort of kind of picking you apart on a slab. Right. It's, I think it's that kind of stuff that makes people uncomfortable, because it's the person who spends 5,000 words thoughtfully explaining why somebody's funny and areas where maybe they're not as funny, or their strengths and weaknesses. I think that can really get inside your head as a performer. And I think you have to, I think you kind of just have to trust the people who are close to you to help you with that stuff.
And with certain high-profile comedians and performers, I suppose Conan O'Brien especially, they get looked at as if they're not quite of this earth. Certainly, that documentary seemed to have that view of Conan O'Brien, but it's always like, well, I realize they're people, but they're also not of the same flesh as I am. So I can say what I want, and they're part robot or part alien or part something. That's how they got to where they are. Must have been. So I can sort of say what I want. Does that mindset seem like it's what's going on here?
Well, I mean, with Conan in particular, he literally looks like he's not of this earth.
I can't put my finger on why, but I understand.
He would say himself, he's freakishly tall. He's very thin. He has an incredibly long lower body. He has this kind of, I don't know, like a coxcomb of hair. So I think when people set their eyes on him, especially out of the context of the show, it's very strange. He doesn't, it's like he's walking among us. I'm
almost shocked to see it.
But don't you get like that around just people who you're accustomed to seeing on TV or in film in general?
What's weird is you get that. I mean, tell me if this is your experience, but it's the same thing. Like when you see a friend in the distance, you're like, oh, there's a friend, I should say hello. But then with the celebrity, you get that a millisecond later. Wait, that's not a friend. But you got the center in your brain lit up like it was a friend, and that sort of makes you angry.
Memories of this person, yeah. None of them are shared, but right. I have you feel you have a sort of intimate connection with them, and I think Conan has that in particular because he was on late night for so many years, and
the documentary shows it too. Everybody thinks they are his friend. It seems like they come right up. It's like, Conan, want to hang out? No, I don't want to hang out.
Right. Yeah, I think. I mean, also, I think if you look at what happened kind of toward the end of the Tonight Show, he, in response to the fans who were upset about, Conan potentially leaving as a host, I think he kind of let his guard down in a certain way. I think he really, I know that we all did, like as writers on the show, I think probably everyone on the staff felt a little less guarded because it seems so genuine, that response seems so genuine that I think there's just like it just seems sort of natural to want to let those people in a little bit more, even though that's generally considered kind of a taboo thing. It's almost like just to respond to that warmth, and I think going out on tour maybe felt like that to a lot of fans too. It was him sort of bringing himself to them in a way and like getting physically closer to them, because they went to a lot of cities where, the show would never have gone, people who would probably have never seen Conan in person. So I think, I think something happened there. You know what I mean? Right. I think it's going to sound unnecessarily heady, but there was a little bit of a kind of, he became a little bit of a folk hero, and as a folk hero, you are of the folk. Right. And so I think that that's why that connection kind of became more intimate. And then I don't, it doesn't hurt that, someone like Conan then is on Twitter or, other celebrities now, do that. Everybody's on Twitter. I think that in general, I think fans feel closer to the people that they, see on TV and in movies, and in some cases maybe even feel a little bit more entitled to ask things of them or to tell them how they feel about them.
Sometimes in a T-shirt form.
And sometimes in T-shirt form, sometimes by holding up a sign on the show in our audience, sometimes by telling them something mean on Twitter or, demanding to know why they haven't replied to them. And,
at reply upon at reply.
That's got to be so strange,
I mean, he's never looked at at replies. I would imagine.
I can't imagine.
Yeah.
I can't imagine.
I mean, I barely look at those, and I don't have 5 million followers.
Right. Yeah, I'm a nobody, and I don't. But I don't know. I think that's something that's just happening in our culture. But I think in his case, a lot of it had to do with that kind of fan movement that kind of revealed itself during the last few weeks of the Tonight Show. I think he got closer to them, and then I think as a result they drew even closer to him. And maybe on the tour there was a lot of that. And I think I haven't seen the documentary, believe it or not. I think I need a little bit of emotional distance.
Yeah, it might put you right back in there. I don't know.
Or just like distance from even working for Conan,
Nothing you don't know about, also.
Yeah. And sometimes I don't need to see it displayed. But I just having seen clips of it, and I know this happened on the tour. He would make time to kind of just, get in the kind of throng of fans. Mm-hmm. And I think that happened all the time. And
there are many of those moments, and many look at Conan berate his staff moments, which that seemed like I don't want to make any claims on the part of the director. It did seem like there was an intent to show that side as well, even if it wasn't equal to the man who goes out among his fans and says hello side. There's like that sort of 50-50 balance imposed upon it. Mm-hmm. Show mean Conan half the time, show happy Conan half the time.
Well, that's very real. And I think that I'd heard that about people who saw the film, but that was like, a little bit jarring to them, seeing some of that, because they didn't understand that it was all for the purpose of comedy. Right. It's like a long running riff, just berating your staff and berating your friends. And I think, as a comedy writer, or just a person who's kind of been in that community around other heartless comedians, I'm a little bit more accustomed to that. That's sort of how we treat each other. There's a lot of love too, but I think that it's very natural to kind of berate each other.
Right. Now, whether we're talking about the run of Late Night or the heyday of David Letterman's show, do you see there being some sort of essential New Yorkiness to those shows that informed their sensibility? I wondered about that. As someone who lived in New York 14 years, someone who's now here in Los Angeles, do you look at those stretches of those shows and think that had to happen in New York in some sense?
No, not necessarily. I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with, I don't know. I mean, maybe some of it is just it's the people who are involved, and it's people who chose to live in New York versus choosing to live in LA, and maybe they have their brain chemistry is screwed up in its own way, and you put enough.
Two different kinds of being screwed up moves you to the either coast.
I think so. Yeah.
What difference do you see in the particular chemistry misalignments that lead you to Los Angeles or New York?
Well, I mean, one of the most sort of defining qualities of somebody living in New York is just a survivor mentality. This belief that life has to be hard.
It's a masochistic type.
It's a little bit masochistic, but it's like you have to earn your life in some way. And I think people on the West Coast are less hung up on that idea. Right. I think that they feel like, life just should come to you. It should be easy. You should be able to put your groceries in the trunk of your car and not have to walk 20 blocks with them like a savage.
I recall you writing about the epic expeditions to get a dish rack in New York, for example.
Yeah, it would be like a half a day. It would take like a half a day to
because the IKEA was far away, or what?
Or because you just you're going to a place like Bed Bath & Beyond in New York, which is maybe far away from where you live in Queens or Brooklyn, and then it's this kind of unwieldy thing, and you have to get on the subway and transfer, and you're packed in there, and sometimes you can't get on the subway because your package is too big to just be on this crowded subway.
I've had that happen here too, though.
Yeah. Well, you use mass transportation here.
That's true. I'm one of those.
Yes. Well, here, that's funny because it's such a mass transportation, which I really do miss. It's such a natural part of living in New York, and
it's coming back in Los Angeles.
I guess so. That's true. The light rail.
Opens tomorrow to Culver City, I think, or near there.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, new line.
Oh, that's good.
Not to make this about something that's not about at all, but anyway, continue.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, though. Like when you're driving by bus stops in LA, it just looks like people who are just about to surrender.
They're going to be crushed under the weight of whatever they're crushed under the weight of pretty soon. So get out of the way.
It looks like the end of the line. It's so vastly different, and in New York, everybody rides the bus or takes the subway.
Buses weren't cool there, though, right? I mean, like you'd take the subway if you could.
Yeah,
you'd avoid a bus.
Yeah. Although I started my last few years living in New York, I started to embrace some of the pleasures of being on a crosstown bus.
I guess for non-New York savvy listeners, how does it break down? Trips you take the subway versus trips you take the bus versus the ones you break down and get a taxi. Like what were the factors that decided what tool you would use to get around there?
How fast I needed to be someplace.
Taxi is the nuclear option, I hear.
Taxi is the nuclear option. The bus is taking the scenic route. Sure. If I had an extra half hour to kill before I had to go somewhere, I would hop on the bus.
Right.
Usually I would walk, though. The subway was a sort of all-purpose form of transportation in New York. The only times that I wouldn't take the subway were if it was just too late or I was too drunk. Those are kind of, and usually those happened in tandem.
Oh, sure.
I was usually too drunk when it was too late. Because sometimes it can just slow down your whole night. You've been out all night and maybe it's 2 a.m. and you think, okay, well, I really need to get home now. I'll go get on the subway. And then you find yourself waiting down that platform for a half an hour.
Oh, they slow down like that at night?
Oh, yeah. And sometimes...
Here they close it at night. So at least that's an improvement.
They're not going to be there.
Right.
Yeah. You would just... the worst possible feeling as a commuter in New York is being on the subway platform for 20 minutes on a weekend, a weekend night, and looking down the platform and seeing the lights of the train and your heart skipping a beat for a second. And then as it gets closer, you realize it's just one of those garbage trains that just doesn't...
Garbage trains.
Yeah,
they don't have those here.
Just don't carry people at all. There's just flats of garbage on them. And it just blows past you. It blows past you.
Are there New York subway stations getting filled with garbage all the time and they need these garbage trains?
I don't know what's on those trains, but they're just shipping things and they're not carrying. Okay. They're not carrying people.
Another garbage train.
Yeah. It's just that feeling. It's because they have the same... They should have a different colored headlight. Like they should have a green light on them or some other colored light so that you know not to be excited that you may get home at a somewhat reasonable hour.
Right, right. Now tell me how... I mean, you were then among a staff group that made the move from New York to Los Angeles when the Late Show with Conan O'Brien became the Tonight Show. The cross country move dramatized in the whole running sequence at the beginning of the new show. Then, tell me what were the attitudes there when the relocation was known to be going to happen?
Well, I started very late at late night. So I started in the last few months. So when they first found out that they were going to be going to LA, I couldn't speak to that because I don't. And
you didn't know whether you would be going with them though until...
No, I didn't. When I started there, I was told that it was a kind of probationary period. And I think I found out that I was going to LA when the person who arranges travel called me to ask me when I wanted to fly out. I never even heard from my boss or anything. It was just
whenever, I guess.
Yeah. I guess that was the first time that I thought, I guess I'm going.
Right.
I guess I'm going. I know when we moved out to LA, there, in the press anyway, there was a lot of that sort of talk about is Conan going to go soft now that he's in LA? There's a real kind of weird attitude about the entertainment business in Los Angeles versus New York. And I mean, you brought it up a little bit earlier, but just the idea that, it's a distinctly New York show and Letterman is a distinctly New York show. And what would it be like in LA? But
this is where 57-year-old guys in Priuses who have a nice long contract to work on a bland sitcom live, right? According to the stereotype.
Yeah. But I think for us, and I still kind of feel this way, especially having moved with an entire staff of New Yorkers, I think a lot of us still regard Los Angeles like aliens visiting another planet. It's true. I mean,
what seems weirdest when you land your spacecraft, or when the spacecraft of Los Angeles lands at you?
I mean, the thing that is just still so bizarre to me is how informal everybody is and how it's just casually dressed. Like, I don't understand.
It kind of bothers me too sometimes, though, and I've never lived in New York.
Put on a shoe. I just feel like your life is pretty easy out here. The weather is lovely. People have more space. Things are very convenient in a lot of ways.
To be fair, they put on one shoe sometimes.
Maybe one shoe sometimes, but there's no excuse for shuffling around in flip-flops. That was I
moved from Santa Barbara where it's even worse. This was a step in the right direction, if you can believe it.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
That I don't know why that drives me crazy. That nobody dresses up for anything, And if you go to an event that's, that says a cocktail attire or semi-formal attire, that can mean anything in Los Angeles. Right. You might find a guy in a Tommy Bahama, shirt with a blazer over it.
Oh dear.
And white jeans and flip-flops. Like it could be a woman in a gown. Like it just doesn't, it's a very confusing place sometimes.
It's kind of the flip side of being able to do whatever you want. With that comes many fascinating things that happen here and are created here, but you'll never escape the other side of that sword, will you? How a lot of people just are phoning in parts of their lives.
Well, yeah. I mean, I guess this is something I kind of miss about New York. And a lot of people maybe considered it not such a great quality in the city, but you couldn't help but be aware of other people all the time in New York, because sometimes you're physically pressed against them. Yes. Sometimes you're smelling them. They're right in your face. So you're constantly aware of other people. So there is a kind of protocol. You walk to the right on the sidewalk, or you walk to the right on a set of steps, and people coming down walk to the left. And there are all these things that are understood where how pressurized the city is. And as people living there, you kind of respect each other's space in that way. And I feel like in Los Angeles, people seem to be much less aware of that there's an entire city of other people around them. In many ways, fast-moving vehicles sometimes, or pedestrians or whatever. There just seems to be less of that awareness in general.
So when you came here fresh from New York City, did your experience make did it make Steve Martin's LA story seem like grinding neorealism? I mean, was this like, oh, everything is true that they said?
Oh, no, not at all. But I think I was more, I definitely had my feelers out in some ways when I first moved here. I was listening more intently for those kinds of signs, and I was looking for them. If anybody said, described a party as having a certain kind of vibe, I would be very attuned to that. Those were my aha moments.
They don't say vibe over there in New York?
It's not, you wouldn't, it's
a good thing, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, like little things, I would.
It's a certain anthropological sense you switched on right away.
Yeah, and I think that was that was maybe the cynical part of me that I needed to shed in order to enjoy living here. Which isn't to say that I've shed my cynicism, but I needed to shed my cynicism about that in particular, and just realize, well, people are just behave a different way here, and it's interesting to observe. But it doesn't always make it categorically better or worse,
Is cynicism a necessary quality for the comedy you do in your mind, or is it something that gets called cynicism in comedy often? But is it something more complicated than that?
Yeah, maybe, yeah. Using cynicism is maybe a little bit flip to describe it. I think it's maybe an unwillingness to accept things at face value. Maybe that's it. A sort of reluctance to do that anyway. And maybe, I don't know. Maybe that comes across as cynical because it's maybe it's a little bit of a downer to people. Like if you're the person who's sort of constantly questioning, constantly wondering why something is the way it is. I think about my parents' generation and how delighted they are to walk the wide aisles of Walmart and Target, and especially and for me, like, I can't enter a situation like that without a certain amount of terror. Like, why is that? Why? Yes. But to my parents, it's just, what's wrong with this? This is amazing. Everything is perfectly arranged. It's so inexpensive.
Did they grow up under sort of straitened circumstances? Is the bounty and plenty of it enough? I mean, because I could see it being that.
Yeah, maybe it is that. It's sort of like, well, what could possibly be wrong with this massive store that's giving me that I'm saving 30 cents on toothpaste, and it's like that. That's sort of the bottom line for them.
But when you ask yourself, well, then what do I find wrong with this place? What is it that's really getting under my skin? Is that a road toward comedy potentially? Can you find comedy by asking that particular type of question? Like, why is this bothering me?
Yeah, I think sometimes, sometimes wondering, why something is the way it is. I mean, there's a really funny sort of like short film they did once on the old Ben Stiller show, the one that was on Fox. That was about one of those, and it was kind of like a simple idea, but I totally understand where it would come from. It was one of those like Bennigan's kinds of places, or or Fuddruckers,
aggressively good times kind of
aggressively
place.
Good times. Everybody's wearing tons of flair. They all have kind of old timey mustaches, and but then it reveals itself to be this sort of sinister thing behind it, because it's sort of like, how could something that sweet be that sweet to the core? There has to be an agenda, right. And maybe I don't know. Maybe it's a part of like what drew me to comedy or writing, or maybe it's a generational thing. I don't really know, but I have a hard time entering any kind of heightened experience without some level of self-consciousness or suspicion, maybe.
Right. Well, there's the heightenedness, but then there's the element of the Bennigans of the world that is like, Bennigans is in on what they're doing, and they're aware that they're sort of trying to pump up this good times experience, and they know what they're doing, and it's the same. It creates this strange scenario of expectations, like you feel pushed in the direction of having a good time, and thus are less willing to have a good time. Or with stand-up comedy, I would imagine, I've never done it. I've never gotten up in front of that brick wall, but that brick wall itself, and the implication or statement that you guys are going to laugh now, that itself just pumps up the challenge for the comedian about tenfold, because, well, you say, I'm going to laugh. Yeah, we'll see about that. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
same deal?
Yeah. There's a little bit of that, like, let's see how this goes. Right. Yeah.
Right. I mean, you'll laugh at the lamest jokes in an office if you work in some company not related to comedy. You'll laugh at the worst jokes. In school, you would laugh at a substitute teacher's worst jokes. But when you get told, okay, you paid to laugh, now you're going to laugh, your standards go up so high.
Yeah. It has to be funny to you. That's the difference with an office. You're laughing to relieve the tedium, the sort of crushing tedium. When you go to a club, it's like going to a theater. You're not just going to settle for something that is, that just washes over you. There are plenty of ways to get that kind of experience. It is heightened in that way.
How when you're writing comedy to get around that effect of the audience expectations being so puffed up by the setting?
Oh, you can't think about that. I don't think. I mean, maybe some people do, and maybe that's not often that kind of comedy isn't the kind of stuff that I'm drawn to necessarily. Although it can be very, very successful in clubs. The people who go, well, I know how to please all of these people. I don't think about that. If I'm doing a club show where I know people are paying, I definitely put a little bit more pressure on myself to sort of treat it like a professional, if that makes any sense. There are plenty of rooms in Los Angeles, New York, wherever you are, where you feel like that pressure's off a little bit. It's like a free night in the back of a bar, and you can use that as an opportunity to sort of stretch a little bit. But for me anyway, maybe because I also just don't do it as often as somebody who is a hardened road comic or somebody who does clubs constantly, I view it as a professional obligation, and therefore it's up to me to be prepared, to the best of my ability, and maybe they'll like it and maybe they won't. As long as I don't know. I don't know that I can be really hard on myself, but if they don't laugh one night, it's a little depressing. But if I've still done a good job, right, then maybe that sort of ameliorates some of the sadness I experience at just not being validated.
Now, I can't help but notice you're wearing a T-shirt with Jim Jarmusch's "Stranger Than Paradise" on it, an image from it, and the title. That has always struck me as a particularly funny film, but it also might not have any jokes. Like, I think it might not have jokes. So,
yeah.
What do you see? Do you see the sort of Jim Jarmusch type thread of comedy as a useful one to draw from as well, or is that sort of so? Is he, for example, so of his own world that there's not much to be learned from the laughs you get from A Stranger Than Paradise?
Oh, no, I think there is. I mean, would that kind of comedy work on a show like Conan? Probably not.
But if it'll work on a show, maybe that's the one.
Maybe. But I mean, I always really liked Jarmusch as a sort of comic writer, because he does something that a lot of comedy writers and directors are afraid to do, which is let the comedy breathe, and I think a lot of what's funny comes from just that pacing, just allowing something to just sit there, allowing a character to sit still for a very long time before speaking. Right. He's using like sort of tension and release in this really, really interesting way. And so, I mean, like little elements of that can work sometimes. I do think it's really funny to to sit, to make the audience sit through something, to have them wait a very, very long time, much longer than they need to wait.
In a film, a little easier than on television, where they might flip to something else, right?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and also, especially film is going to be different than live television because you are still dealing with the fact that there's a studio audience there, and they have other things that they can be looking at that moment. Maybe when you're experiencing it at home. Again, it's one of those things that can be more successful at home than it would be if you're witnessing it live.
You're seeing through camera 3. You can't watch camera 4 guy pushing something.
Exactly. Yeah. You can't watch the one of the members of the band cleaning out his reed or something. Yeah. You're more captive at home, I think.
How does that translate to writing articles, just writing text pieces, writing parts of books? The humor of getting somebody to sit through something seems so valuable in any medium, but I wonder if that's something you can still do in text, or does the fact that they have to put forth effort they have to actually read, affect it?
Yeah, you're asking a lot from them,
I hate to say asking a lot, but I mean,
these days you kind of are.
They can't just sit there and it doesn't just come to them. They do have to actively next sentence. Yes,
you're as much of a participant as the writer, I guess. Whereas, with television, it's certainly more, you experience it more passively, I guess. I don't know. I mean, maybe, I would say, sure, a better writer than I could do that. I think my tendency is to, and it's sort of a bad tendency that I'll try to curb here and there when I actually see it. Is I will get nervous about holding the reader's attention, and I will insert what I know to be jokes. And I think as I hopefully grow as a writer, I'll be less dependent on that and just trust that the experience of reading it the humor will come out, but I would, and I know these days, if I have a writing assignment, I did something for GQ a few months back, I'll go through it and I'll look at things that maybe I'll find it funny, but I'll say, well, that's so clearly a joke. I put that in there because I felt I was too nervous to get out of this paragraph without a surefire laugh in it. And it's that same kind of bad impulse that you have as a stand-up where you're worried about, I can't get off the stage until I close with a big laugh. Everybody worries about their closer. And maybe it's a sign of growing, or maybe it's a lack of professionalism, but that's something I care less about these days. I just feel like, have I said what I wanted to say? Okay, it's time to go, and I try to sort of avoid that in my writing too. Just sort of, I don't always catch it, and I am often guilty of doing it, but I try not to.
Have you seen the anxiety to hold audience attention poison every type of comedy equally? I mean, is it no matter what you're doing, if you're anxious about keeping people on board, you're not going to keep them on board?
Yeah. I think I think people can read that. I think people are, just like we read off each other socially, I think people are smart enough to understand that's what's happening, you know? And I also think that if that's constantly your goal, then you are creating a lot of very small and maybe insignificant moments, and you're losing something much bigger, which is this sort of have you actually communicated something, you know, like have you given that person like a real legitimate experience, you know, rather than just, I don't know. It's the difference between telling somebody a sort of long and funny story that they'll remember and be able to tell somebody else, and walking up to them and tickling them. You know what I mean? They're both going to elicit laughter, but
yes, it's got to be, that has to be an ever-present temptation when you're writing for something that publishes frequently, shall we say, whether it's the Onion News Network or whether it's a show on every night. Like, we're doing this in this endless cycle. Mm-hmm. We can get through the next few cycles with the sort of equivalent of tickling. Mm-hmm. Maybe we should. Maybe we need to do that for a while.
Oh,
but
yeah.
We just cannot lose sight that we don't want to be tickling. Ultimately, we don't want to go out as a one big tickle, right?
You don't want that to be your legacy. That, you know, you want to be able to have a, you know, in 2 years have like a greatest hits reel. You know, like things that were kind of memorable and impactful in some way. But yeah, I think we're definitely guilty of that at Conan, and I think any time you're producing a daily comedy show, you can get caught up in the news cycle, and you can. There are two types of comedy that will get on our show, based on how they're rehearsed. I think there's stuff that makes everybody laugh at rehearsal, including Conan and Andy, and they're tough. They're a tough laugh, and you just know, oh, that's going on. That's great. And then there's other stuff that gets the reaction. That'll work. You know, and sometimes you need those that'll works to kind of just help you, almost to sort of help you maintain inertia, you know, or maintain not inertia, a kind of momentum for the show. They're less risky, but do you want your show to be all that'll works? No.
And it seems like the perception of the various Conan O'Brien shows from the fans is that they have delivered more pure silliness than other shows, but at the same time also delivered more lasting memories to the audience as well. Like, on both ends of the spectrum, it has delivered in large quantities. I don't know if that's the way you've seen it, but it seems like at the extreme ends, those have really been the strengths of these three late night shows.
Yeah, I think so. And I think even the stuff that's just examples of extreme silliness are meaningful. You know, I know that they work.
Yeah, some of them meet at the top of the circle, the silliness and the meaning touch. And I guess that's what you want.
Yeah. I mean, like, some of that stuff is the most meaningful to me. And I think, like, maybe the reason it is meaningful is that people are pleased that you just were so committed to something so ludicrous, you know, that, oh, wow, they really, you know, they found this completely inane idea, and they built it, and they built a whole piece around it, or, you know, and you remember things like that. You know, we did something on the show recently that I still think about. We do this. It's like one of those character walk things. It's mascots who shouldn't dunk. It was based on those kind of like how in the All-Star games, basketball All-Star games, during halftime, they'd have like the mascots come out and dunk. And we deliberately make these horrible mascots that are like too unwieldy in certain ways to dunk. And one that we did was a little person with 14-foot arms. And it's so stupid, and it has no meaning at all.
And I'm laughing and envisioning it. I haven't seen it.
It was this guy who was a little person. He was, you know, like 3.5 feet tall, but he had 14-foot long arms in front of him. And it's so
dragging, or were they on?
No, they were in front of him. They were sort of
holding out
in front of him. Yeah. And they were rigged up in such a way that he could actually make the hands clap and move them because they were sort of around his own arms, which was even funnier. But so sometimes just that sight, because even if you could conceive it, the fact that somebody would go ahead and make it and let you look at it is to me somehow meaningful. Like that stuff makes an impact. Like, wow, they came up with that and then they built it. Now we all get to watch it, and it is dumb.
You alluded just a bit earlier to the sort of removal of the easy jokes at the end of paragraphs, and wondering, am I getting? I mean, is this a move of maturity or a move of complacency? And I wonder the sort of the task of telling maturity from complacency in any given choice. How large does that loom in your own head?
Oh, constantly. Yeah, constantly. I especially.
Can you ever tell before you hear the reaction back, or is it just like, well, I guess this is maturity, or I guess this is complacency?
Well, I'd like to think that it's maturity when I'm self-aware, and it's complacency when I just stop thinking about it. Perhaps I don't know though. I mean, maybe it's just maybe I've got it all mixed up. But I certainly worry about that, especially being in the entertainment industry. It's a really scary industry to be in, and especially when you see people who are older in this industry and how little they're respected, I think. And sometimes how, like you said, how complacent they become, it can be a very lucrative business to be in. And, people maybe sometimes don't try as hard because they realize they didn't have to.
And does that actually happen more often here in Los Angeles than in New York, do you think?
I couldn't say. I couldn't say.
No one really knows, maybe.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I just don't know. I'm sure it happens in New York. There's certainly more stuff to buy. There's certainly more ways to entertain yourself and to sort of indulge that complacency.
Things seem more expensive too, so you have a little more of a fire under you, right, over there?
I suppose so. Yeah, yeah, and just like I said, life's just a little harder there. But yeah, it's something I definitely worry about. That I'm not going to be observing things as keenly. I won't notice things as much because I'm just not paying attention to them because I'm just, maybe that's the thing that my parents have. Maybe it's not a generational, maybe it's an age thing. They're done fighting. They're just not fighting. Yeah. They're not fighing Walmart. They're not fighting.
Just wheel me out to the Walmart. It's okay.
I just need a lot of toilet paper. I don't need to think about, how, the sort of sociological or anthropological impact of my decision to buy all this toilet paper at this box store. Maybe they just got exhausted. But yeah, I do worry about that. I remember hearing a story about how sometimes older comedy writers, guys who used to run television shows and had a tremendous amount of pull in the industry, have lost it and will use young, attractive proxies. So they'll pitch ideas through these other people. So it's their idea, but they'll send a kind of young, attractive actor / writer to go in and take the meetings and pitch them and stuff because they think that the industry, the executives are going to be more open-minded when...
Does this work?
I think it does. No. I think it might. Yeah. For some people, perhaps. But it's just that vision haunts me. The vision of me in my flip-flops, in my Hawaiian shirt,
white
sitting
jeans.
Sitting on my incredibly soft leather couch, telling some 22-year-old kid about my idea for a bunch of college kids who move back home. When you go in there.
You keep that vision in your mind, though, as a way of avoiding it.
Oh God, yeah, it's true. It's healthy to use those kinds of things as a way to avoid them, as a sort of God's eye, to keep away the demons.
I've been speaking here in Silver Lake with comedian, writer, and comedy writer Todd Levin. You'll know his work from the 3 late-night Conan O'Brien shows. You'll know his work from the book Sex, Our Bodies Are Junk, and others. You'll know his work from publications like GQ, Gourmet, The Morning News, Vanity Fair, and more. Todd, thanks so much for taking the time today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with all of the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene. Always mess that up. On colinmarshall.org. Thanks. And special thanks to the people backing this season, including Aidan Nullman, Andy Cooney, Ben Bartley, Brian J. Dell, Doubt Us Artwork, Greg Bigelow, Greg Linster, Henry Coronan, Humberto Grant, James Faber, Jonathan McCalmont, Mark Larson, Matt Warren, Mia Muratori, Nicholas Croft, Paul Doyle, Ray McGuire, Rob Montz, Robert Foley, Roberto Medri, Samuel Hansen, Sean Dudley, Small Demons, Stephen Ingles, Steve Himmer, TSD, and Wayne Wright.